Cesaro had reportedly signed a new contract with WWE last year. And we all thought that he was locked up for a while. I remember people were very disappointed to hear the news that he had re-signed. As it turns out, he wasn't locked up at all. This was a surprise to find out about this week. Now, I don't know if he only signed a one-year deal or if there was a miscommunication somewhere, but his contract was coming due, which is why he hasn't won a match on television since November, and might explain why he was left out of the Royal Rumble match last month. They weren't going to push him unless he re-signed. And PW Insider broke the news on Thursday that Cesaro has quietly exited WWE after his contract expired. Cesaro is gone. His last match was a loss to Happy Corbin 2 weeks ago. How sad that it looks like Baron Corbin will go down as the man who retired Kurt Angle and Cesaro from WWE. The two sides were said to have been in negotiations for weeks, but were unable to come to terms on a new agreement, and since his contract expired, he would not be bound by any sort of non-compete. He is free and clear as of now to go where he wants, when he wants. You know, WWE has re-signed Kevin Owens, Sami Zayn, AJ Styles in recent months, all of whom have been there less time than Cesaro has, but they've also been pushed at a higher level than he has. So I'm not sure how much money he was asking for, but he was obviously looking for a raise, and WWE didn't think that he was worth whatever he was asking for. Fightful Select says the news has been met internally with disappointment and dismay, as he was very well liked. Yeah, just because he's a free agent now does not mean the two sides can't still come to an agreement. I mean, you could probably say the same about Cody and AEW, although nobody seems to know what's going on the Cody Rhodes front. It's been radio silent this week. We don't know if something is signed and they're keeping it hush-hush or what's going on there. But again, Cesaro could very well, it seems unlikely, but he could very well end up back in WWE before all is said and done. Because, look, I mean, last year he re-signed with them, apparently, so he was happy enough then, even if it was for only a year. He did sign something and he decided to stay when he could have left, and he would have gotten no shortage of offers, believe me. And he chose to stay. He was happy enough to stay. But now he's gone. And when I look back, and you guys know I've been a big fan of his work now for many years. As long as I've been doing this podcast for, this is going to be the 15th year I am doing this show. For almost the entire length of me doing the show, I have been talking about this man from his Ring of Honor days until he came to WWE, Antonio Cesaro, and he came in as the former rugby player who was too violent, and they put Oksana with him, and eventually they cut her out of the act, and they cut his first name off, and, you know, I've talked about Cesaro quite a bit over the years. Big fan of his. He debuted on television, you know, when I look back at his WWE career, it's very much a mixed bag. He debuted on television for them in 2012. And a few months later, they put the United States Championship on him. So the year he debuted on TV, they made him U.S. Champion. That is the only singles title that Cesaro held in a decade of working for WWE. And think about how they moved these titles around, whether it's U.S. or Intercontinental. I'm not even counting the ugly green belt. Even World Championships. Look at some of the people they put the WWE title on. And in a decade, the only singles title this man ever held was the United States Championship. It's kind of shocking to me. I look at a lot of the other mid-card names on the roster at that time. People like Dolph Ziggler and Kofi Kingston and Jinder Mahal. They all held multiple championships, even had runs as world champions. But not Cesaro. Because Vince McMahon never saw him at that level. He was used primarily as a tag team specialist. 7 tag team titles this man held. He tagged with Jack Swagger as the Real Americans. He tagged with Tyson Kidd. He tagged with Sheamus. And he tagged with Shinsuke Nakamura. And every single one of those teams, except the team with Nakamura, which it was never really anything special. But all the rest of them, they all got over. And Cesaro was a very big part of why. You know, the real Americans, it took a while, but they were really starting to get over when they broke them up. Cesaro and Tyson Kidd were getting over. Until Kidd got hurt in the match with Samoa Joe and he got forced into an early retirement. He's lucky to be alive. The Bar, even the Bar, they got over pretty good. Everything they put this guy in, he excelled at. But that's what Vince McMahon saw him as, a tag team guy. And it is a real sin because he could have been so much more than that. I'm not sitting here and saying that he should have taken the spot that Brock Lesnar got, or that he would have been in the spot that Roman Reigns is in now. I'm not saying that. But for all of those tag team titles they put on him, he underachieved. For his talent level and what he brought to the table, he will always go down as one of the biggest underachievers in that company in the last decade. And someone who was never fully appreciated by upper management. The fans appreciated him. The other talent, they loved him to death. But the one person he needed love from the most didn't give it to him. He gave him a job. He kept him employed through all these waves and waves and waves of releases. You know, he saw him as a great utility player off the bench, to use a baseball analogy. But he deserved better. You know, I was in the Superdome at WrestleMania, the night that he won the Andre the Giant Memorial Battle Royal, and he body slammed Big Show out of the ring. One of the greatest feats of strength that you'll ever see. It was a moment I won't forget. I will never forget the way the crowd exploded for him that night. They wanted to see him win, and when he picked up Big Show, I mean, there were people, their mouths, their jaws dropped. And I always said, the key to getting this guy over, you could talk about charisma and promos, and yes, it's a combination of all of those things. But he had something that not a lot of people on that roster had at the time. He was deceptively strong, and he could do things in the ring that wowed people. And they could have done a better job of utilizing that as a way to help get him over. Because it got him over in the building that night, I could tell you that. There was nobody in that crowd that I could see who was disappointed to see Cesaro walk away with that big Battle Royal win at WrestleMania. It really felt like a star-making moment for him. The next night in the building, he was probably the second most popular wrestler behind Daniel Bryan, who had just won the championship in the main event the night before. Hulk Hogan was out there to present the trophy to him. Cesaro, remember, he yanked the mic out of Zeb Coulter's hand? Everybody cheered, and he said, "Sorry, Zeb, I'm not a Zeb Coulter guy anymore. I'm a Paul Heyman guy." And the place went nuts. Only Paul Heyman could pull off being one of the most despised people in the building in one segment because, you know, he had helped Brock Lesnar break the Undertaker's streak the night before, and everybody was pissed off about that. Only he could pull off being so despised in one segment and then come back out later in the show and be wildly cheered. And part of that was, you know, it's the night after WrestleMania crowd, but still. But when it was over, I had high hopes that this was going to end up better for Cesaro than it ended up for Curtis Axel. You know, because Curtis Axel got paired up with Heyman the year before this. And they were together for, you know, a few months, but, you know, it didn't really go anywhere after that. I wouldn't say it really did a whole hell of a lot for Curtis Axel. And I was hoping, okay, this can't possibly be worse than that. This has got to be better. It wasn't. It was somehow worse. At least Curtis Axel got an Intercontinental title win out of it. Cesaro actually ended up worse off for it, and he was less over when they ended the pairing out of nowhere without any explanation. They didn't shoot any kind of an angle, nothing. Every week, every single week, Paul Heyman would come out on television, he would have Cesaro standing right next to him, and he would talk about being the advocate for Brock Lesnar, the man who ended The Undertaker's undefeated streak at WrestleMania. Over and over and over. And I thought the setup here is perfect. They have a plan. Silly me. But I'm thinking, man, this is perfect. Cesaro eventually has got to grow tired of hearing Heyman put over somebody else when he's out there. That'll lead to the eventual breakup. And after Brock Lesnar wins the championship, which he did from John Cena at SummerSlam, he destroyed him. You've got a story there. you've got a story there for the taking, with Cesaro splitting off from Heyman and challenging Lesnar for the title, maybe at the Royal Rumble, or something, and they never did it. Cesaro and Brock Lesnar never had a singles match against each other when that would have been the best time to do it. And he wasn't going to win, but boy, you think of how he could have benefited from being in there. He is one of the few people on that roster at the time who could have legitimately thrown Brock Lesnar around like a small child. He didn't have to win. Just by being in there with him and being competitive, it would have got him over that much more. It would have given him credibility that he still, even at that point, didn't have. And I can never understand why they never did anything with the pairing of Cesaro and Heyman. It's like they just lost interest. It just didn't make any sense to me. Until I saw Paul Heyman's appearance on the Sam Roberts Show. They did a live show at Caroline's on Broadway here in New York to promote the Brock Lesnar Undertaker rematch at SummerSlam in 2015. That was going to be their first match since the end of the streak the year before at WrestleMania. And Heyman was in town to promote. And a fan in the audience asked Heyman during the Q&A portion, he asked him about Cesaro and what went wrong. And Heyman explained exactly what the mindset was for the pairing with Cesaro. He said, look, Brock Lesnar broke the streak. And then he went back on hiatus, right? As he would always do. He would disappear for months at a time. Brock Lesnar is practically full-time now compared to his schedule back then. WWE wanted to find a way to keep Paul Heyman on television in Brock's absence so that he could constantly remind people that Brock Lesnar ended The Undertaker's undefeated streak until Brock was finally ready to come back. Because it was such a big moment, they didn't want it to go to waste by Heyman and Lesnar both just vanishing from television, and then it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind, and people almost forget about it. How they did that was that they put Cesaro with Paul Heyman. That way, they had an excuse to put Heyman on television every single week, not to put over Cesaro, but to put over a guy who wasn't even on the show. There was never any plan to push Cesaro. It didn't matter how loudly the crowds were cheering for him and how over he was starting to get. It didn't matter to them. He never had a chance. And Heyman said he felt horrible for the guy. He said he was miserable being on camera while Paul was standing next to him doing this. But behind the scenes, he said, well, at least it got him noticed by Vince McMahon because he's not sure. This is what Heyman said. He said he's not sure Vince even really noticed Cesaro before that. The guy had already been working there for a few years. And he was practically invisible. They squandered what could have been a huge opportunity for this guy. The pairing wasn't a failure in their eyes because it did exactly what it was designed to do. But I don't ever want to hear anybody tell me that Cesaro, he didn't get over. He got over. He got over big that year. And as they have done with others over the years, who they tell, go get yourself over, right? Isn't that what Brock Lesnar said on Pat McAfee show a couple of weeks ago? I'm waiting for somebody to go get themselves over. He did. And then they pulled the rug right out from under him. How far would he have gone? What was his ceiling? What was Cesaro's ceiling in 2014? We'll never know. Because they didn't even try. Everyone remembers the Stone Cold podcast with Vince McMahon in 2014. Austin specifically brought up Cesaro, and he asked Vince, what's he missing? What is he missing that's stopping you from doing more with him? What's stopping him from breaking through? And Vince said that he lacked charisma. He lacked the verbal skills. He said maybe it's because he's Swiss. Maybe it's the European style. I don't know. But he said right now Cesaro didn't have the it factor. And I loved Austin to death there because he pushed back on that. He said, look, this guy was really, he was starting to really like this guy. And he had a ton of momentum when they put him with Paul Heyman, and then it seemed like he got lost in the shuffle. He was getting over. This is what Austin was saying to Vince, right to his face. The guy was getting over. He goes, then they put him with Heyman, a heel manager, and he was less over. And Austin said, well, from a booking standpoint, what can be done to get him, back up to that level? What can be done to heat him up again? And Vince just looked at him and goes, I don't know. I don't have all the answers. Yes. But it was the booking that Austin was talking about that killed that momentum. Even he could see that. And I think Steve Austin knows a thing or two about pro wrestling, and Vince had no answer. He said he wasn't connecting with the audience. He was connecting with the audience. That's a lie. He was connecting with the audience. At the time, Vince is right. His promos were not the best. He's not wrong about that. But to say that the man, he's got no charisma, that's just flat out not true. Charisma and promo skills, they're not the same thing. Promo skills are only one part of what charisma is. It's kind of hard to define exactly what charisma is. I think you kind of look at somebody or hear them speak, and in a lot of cases, you do know right away if they have it or not. The Rock, he's an extreme example, of course, but you look at The Rock, you listen to The Rock, the guy has it. Whatever that fucking thing is, he's got it. I kind of feel the same way now when I look and I hear LA Knight in NXT. Only a matter of time. Once he gets called up to the main roster, there should be no reason why he can't get over as a big star. But of course, this is WWE, so where there's a will, there's a way. They'll find a way probably to make it not work. But certain people you could just look at and you know. Cesaro, it may not have been as obvious, but to say that he had no charisma whatsoever, he got to show off more of that in the years that followed. He most definitely had charisma. But it's tough, when your boss loses that confidence in you and doesn't see it in you. That's a hard thing to overcome. When Daniel Bryan was on the creative team early last year, he went to bat for Cesaro. He wanted to put his friend over. That's why he got the sudden push that he did. That, and he supposedly signed a new deal. So he got wins on TV over Daniel Bryan. He got a win at WrestleMania. He got a Universal title match on pay-per-view. I knew it wasn't going to last. I told you that on the podcast. I said, enjoy it while it lasts, because this is not going to be a long-term thing. Cesaro's going to be right back where he was before. So I knew it wasn't going to last, but at least he finally had a chance to do something meaningful on the show. Now, a lot of it, unfortunately, came in the Thunderdome in front of virtual fans, so it wasn't the same as when you would look out at some of those crowds, 6-7 years ago, and people were going nuts, and they were holding up Cesaro section signs. Even if it was one person printing all of those signs and handing them out, you had all these people who said, sure, I'll hold this up. I like this guy. Right? So it was very different being in the fucking Thunderdome. It wasn't exactly the same thing, but at least he got the chance. For a company that values mainstream media and publicity and that kind of stuff, and having their champions, go out and do interviews and represent the company in a positive way, you have a guy here who speaks 5 different languages. It's a shame he was never given a chance to do more than he did. He was featured at times. He did have success in the company. You cannot say that Cesaro was a failure in WWE. That is one thing I will not sit here and say. I could complain and be upset about how they should have done more with him at this moment and that moment, and God, who knows where that would have gone. But I cannot sit here and tell you that Cesaro was a failure in WWE. A failure would not spend 10 years working for the same company. And he is not underrated. I'm sick of hearing people, they misuse this word with these people sometimes. And they say, oh, he's so underrated. Cesaro was so underrated. Everybody knows how fucking good he really is. He's very highly rated. But he was grossly underutilized. That's the word you're looking for. He was underutilized for much of his run in that company. And it's a shame that his last WrestleMania match was the first and only singles match he ever got at WrestleMania. It was last year against Seth Rollins. Seth Rollins, who was his very first opponent in FCW when he first signed with WWE. And he beat him. And he got his pay-per-view main event against Roman Reigns at WrestleMania Backlash, his first and only Universal title match. And they went out there and they had an excellent match. But I'll say the same thing that I said a year ago when there was all that discussion about him. Is he going to re-sign with WWE? Is he going to stay? Is he going to go? Almost a year ago to the day on this podcast, I said that I think he would fit in perfectly in New Japan Pro Wrestling. I actually would have preferred seeing him there more than I would have in AEW. And I still feel the same exact way today. AEW's roster has only grown bigger since then. If he goes there now, he's going to get hot right out of the gate, and then he's going to get lost in a sea of new faces. They're still bringing in new faces. But the talent pool in New Japan that he would get to work with, Cesaro in the G1 this year, holy shit. Sign me up. Bryan Danielson just did an interview saying he wanted to be in the G1. Imagine getting Danielson against Cesaro as a G1 match. It could happen. It could very well happen this year. If he doesn't mind the travel. I don't know where his head is at as far as where he wants to work. The main obstacle for him, if New Japan was a serious consideration, the main obstacle is the COVID restrictions that are still in place. A lot of those shows over there are still restricted to 50% capacity. It has not opened back up the way things have here in the States. So New Japan may not be a viable option for him for a while. Whatever choice he makes, I'll be happy to see him land somewhere and do well. He will not be without a contract for very long. That I can promise you. I only wish the WWE had shown him more respect as a single star earlier in his career.